Today's shiur is Sotah Daf Vav. Before we begin the actual Gemara text, by simply skimming ahead, you'll notice a series of triangles, each one highlighting the expression pshita, meaning something seems to be obvious. And on the side of the Gemara, we have a mivneh, a structural note, where a triangle appears, and we've written pshita. That's the highlighted word. Sidra shel halachas hashnuyos b'mishnah. We have a series of halachas that are taught in the Mishnah. Shekol achas, each one l'cha'ira, at first glance seems to be pshita, seems to be obvious, and that which is obvious need not be taught in the Mishnah. So let's go through each one of those halachas. The shiur begins 14 lines from the bottom of Daf Chof Vav Amud Aleph. The Mishnah taught Eshes Mamzer LeMamzer, the wife of a Mamzer, who's married to a Mamzer. Both of them are Mamzerim, and the Mamzer had warned his wife, who was a Mamzeres. Why are we emphasizing that? We're talking about it's a legitimate marriage. It's a kosher marriage. And the Mishnah said either she drinks, in the event, of course, that she became a Sotah, or if she refuses to do thusly, she loses her ksuba. So on this, the Gemara asks, Pshita, is this not obvious? What's different about this marriage than any other regular marriage where a wife who becomes a suspect is subjected to the rules of Sotah? The Gemara answers, Mahu detema. I might have thought, without it being taught in the Mishnah, that afushi psulim lo lefush. Afushi means increase. What is the status of the child of a mamzer couple? He too is a mamzer. Mamzer is someone illegitimate and not not acceptable to marry into the rank and file of the Jewish people. So this kind of couple, if the woman is then found to be innocent, she goes back to her husband and they have more children. So it might have been in our national interest, so to speak, that she shouldn't have the Sotah option, which would enable her, after falling under suspicion, to have her innocence proven by the drinking of the water with her coming out, nothing happening to her. And as I said before, that would simply result in their getting back together and having more children. So maybe she shouldn't have the privilege of the Sotah process. Komash Malon, the Mishnah reveals to us that even so, she does have the benefit of the process that we know as the Sotah process, and hence her innocence can be established and go back to her husband and have more mamzer children. Eshes ger v'eved mishuchlar, the wife of a convert, or the wife of a slave who was freed. A slave who is freed gains the status of a equivalent of a regular Jew. So once again, you have an acceptable marriage. A Jewish woman marries a convert. That's a wonderful marriage. Why does the Mishnah have to teach that if she falls under suspicion that she has the option of drinking the Sotah water? Is that obvious? Pshita. The Gemara asks, is it not simple? Is it not obvious? Why does this need to be taught? Mahu detema. Without the Mishnah teaching this, I would have thought, based on the pasuk, it says Daber el bnei Israel. This, of course, is in the parsha of Sotah, as you can see on the side from Bamidbar Hey pasuk Yud Beis, where the Almighty instructs Moshe Rabbeinu to speak to the Bnei Yisrael, Velo Gerim. I would have thought Bnei Yisrael is an expression that says that the parsha of Sotah applies to Bnei Yisrael, not to converts. Komash Malon. So the Mishnah reveals that's not the way to look at the pasuk. The Gemara asks, Aim v'ema hochinami. Well, one second, maybe that really is the meaning of the pasuk, that Bnei Israel is here to exclude the community of converts, and the parsha of Sotah would have no relevance to them. The Gemara responds, V'omarta, the word V'omarta appears in that pasuk, ribuya hu. Even though you would translate it as and say to them, but it's a word that has this ability of adding more to the simple reading of the pasuk. So even though the simple reading of the pasuk may have sounded like an exclusion of converts, that is not so. The Mishnah said, Eishes Kohen Shoisa, the wife of a Kohen. Woman is married to a Kohen and she falls under suspicion. She was warned not to be with so-and-so, and then she goes into seclusion. So the Mishnah tells us that the Kohen brings his wife to the Beis HaMikdash and she drinks the Sotah. Isn't all that obvious? Pshita. Mahu detema. Here the Gemara explains what I would have thought without the Mishnah. The pasuk says in the parsha of Sotah, it says, "V'hi loy nitpasa asura." The pasuk describes the woman if she was not nitpasa, if she was not raped, and she had intimacy. That's a willing partner. It's a willing partner, asura. A woman like that who has intimacy in a non-rape context, meaning a willing intimacy with another man, she becomes prohibited to her husband. Now we can infer from this that the parsha of Sotah is describing a woman that nitpasa, had she been raped, muteris, she would be allowed to go back to her husband. That happens to be true with regard to most of the Jewish people. The realm of Kohanim is an exception. Vizu means the wife of a Kohen. Even if she was raped, and that's of course a very unfortunate situation, nevertheless, the Almighty rules that she is not allowed to return to her husband. Vizu is a pronoun referring to the Eishes Kohen. Hayil v'nitpasa asura. Since in her case, even if she is raped, she is forbidden to go back to her husband. Ema lo tishteh. I would have thought that the parsha of Sotah is not relevant. Literally, lo tishteh means she doesn't drink, meaning that the Sotah procedure is not relevant to her. Once again, the Torah says in the parsha of Sotah, the kind of woman that we're describing in the parsha of Sotah is a woman that if she is not raped, she's a willing partner, she's Ozer. But if she was raped, she would be permitted to go back to her husband. The wife of a Kohen, it doesn't fit in that category, because even if she is raped, she cannot go back to her husband. So I would have thought that the parsha of Sotah has no relevance to the wives of Kohanim. Kamash Malon, our Mishnah tells us that even so, the parsha of Sotah does have relevance to the wives of Kohanim, and she has the option to drink. The Mishnah said, Eishes Kohen shoisa umuteres l'bayla. The wife of a Kohen, if she drinks the Sotah water and nothing happens to her, so she's allowed to go back to her husband, the Kohen. Pshita, is that not obvious? She drank, nothing happens, she goes back to her husband. Omar Rav Huna b'misnavna. Our Mishnah is describing a case of that wife of a Kohen. After she drinks, she starts to become ill. She starts to decline. The Gemara says, "Oh, misnavna habotku amaya." Well, that's a sign that she was involved with immorality. Why would she then be allowed to go back to her husband? The Gemara answers, "B'misnavna derech evorim." We're describing this wife of a Kohen that starts to decline in health, but not in the regular way of a immoral woman after drinking the water. The normal way is first her belly starts to bloat, and her legs or her feet start to fall, using the language of the pasuk more or less. What happens here? Her health starts to decline, but starting from her head. That's derech evorim. Rashi says, B'nisnavno derech hevorim. You can notice the Rashi about a quarter of the way up from the end. She'eno misnavno b'meyayim v'rechayim. She isn't declining through her belly and her legs. Rather, her head and other limbs feel heavy upon her. Ma'udetema ha lav schus tolo la. The imkein havalo l'snav derech bedika samayim. Ela ba'ina zinsa. Lefikach misnavna shelo kedarka. Ulukohen miotitzar. So let's go over that by going on in the Gemara. Once again, the Mishnah with the wife of the Kohen, she starts to decline, but derech hevorim, through other limbs. Mahu detema. I might have thought, namely without the Mishnah, I would have thought, oh, here's a wife of a Kohen, she drank the water, and she starts to decline health-wise in an unusual fashion. I would have thought, ha zanuye zanoi. This wife of the Kohen was in fact involved with an act of sexual intimacy. The reason that the water doesn't check her out, doesn't have the effect in the normal Sotah fashion, mishum de ba'oines zanoi ulagabi kohen asira, because her intimacy was not a willing intimacy, it was through a rape. And when it comes to a Kohen, a rape, in fact, would make the wife prohibited. So that this misnavna, in the unusual way, when it comes to an Ashes Kohen, is really a sign of prohibition. Chomash Malon, the Mishnah tells us not to say that, but rather she is allowed to go back to her husband. Why this is happening to her? So maybe it's some type of a viral attack or some other. We'll call it a non punishment for immorality or it's a non-reaction, because if you're even according to the Havamim, if we're going to set it up as a case of rape, we're not dealing with a sin, but we're dealing with a topic that would create prohibition. So the final point is that there is no element of prohibition whatsoever that this physical decline would indicate. Why it's happening to her, that's not relevant to our discussion. But one thing is for sure, as far as the maskona of the Gemara, the fact that the Mishnah says she's muteres l'bayla indicates that there was no problem of some type of forbidden intimacy. Ashes soris shoisa. A soris is a man who is incapable of procreation. The Mishnah says that a woman married to a soris, if she is found to have violated his warning not to be in private with so-and-so, she is brought to the Beis HaMikdash to drink the waters as a sotah. More says, Pshita, is that not obvious? Mahu the Tema, without the Mishnah, I would have thought, Mi baladei isheich Oma Rachmona. The pasuk in the Parsha of Sotah says, Mi baladei isheich. The implication, again on a translation level, as Rashi says, Mashma de Isha, her husband, Bar Hochihu, a regular, healthy male spouse. That's what I would have thought the Torah is addressing, namely, a woman who falls under suspicion of being with a man other than her own healthy, regular, productive male husband. And the Hai Lav Bar Hochihu, Hai is the Soris, is not in that category of a regular, healthy man. He's not a Bar Hochi. Bar Hochi means a healthy, fit male, and we say healthy, we're talking in the realm of reproduction. Komash Malon, the Mishnah reveals to us that the Torah is not insistent on that type of husband in order for the Sotah process to be relevant. We take a look at Rashi. Komash Malon, de la mikdam shchivas baal leboyel hu da'asa. the pasuk that says Mi baladei ishech comes to tell us a rule that we've learned in the past, that in order for the Sotah process to set in, all that we require is that the husband had been the one to have the first act of intimacy with her before the paramour. That's what we learn from Mi baladei ishech. Visaurus bar shchivahu. The Saurus, he is capable of having intimacy with a woman. V'afagav delav bar zriyahu. Even though he's not capable of zriya's seed, male seed, he's not capable of reproduction. He doesn't have that capacity to him. But as far as lying together with a woman in an intimate fashion, that he is able to do. Let's turn back to the Gemara. Al yidei kol arayas mekanin. A husband can warn his wife with regard to any man, including men that are forbidden to his wife anyway. Her father, her brother, and if she's found to have violated his warning, namely his wife went into seclusion with her father, the Sotah process sets in and she can be made to drink. Gemara says, Pshita, is that not obvious? That the husband has a right to warn against these arayas as well? The Gemara continues at the top of Amid Beis. Mahu detema. Without the Mishnah, I would have thought Nitme'ah, Nitme'ah. The word Nitme'ah appears several times in the Parsha, and we learn from the repetition of the word Nitme'ah, Shnei Pamim, Echad L'Baal, V'Echad L'Boil. In this case, we're referring to 2 times that the word Nitme'ah appears. One is to tell us about the prohibition to the Baal. Sotah woman is not allowed to be with her husband in intimacy anymore, until, of course, she drinks, and she is not allowed to be with the Boel, with the paramour. She's forbidden to both. And basically, the Parsha of Sotah also includes cases where we know she had been involved with forbidden relations, and a woman that was a willing partner in forbidden relations with another man, she becomes prohibited to her husband, and she becomes prohibited, and I'm emphasizing the word here, becomes. Through the intimacy with the outsider, she becomes prohibited to him as well. Namely, if her husband dies, she cannot go and marry that paramour. So, Heicha deka mitzura bahaznus. I would have thought without the Mishnah that the Parsha of Sotah has relevance to a boel, to a paramour, that only because of this act of intimacy does she become prohibited. Avolha. But with regard to other forbidden relatives, her father, her brother, are they also only because of this intimacy? No. Since she is prohibited anyway to them, Eimolo. I might have thought that the Parsha of Sotah doesn't have relevance to a man like that, to an erva. Komash Malon. So the Mishnah tells us that, in fact, the husband can warn against her being in seclusion with a man that's also to her anyway, even without an act of intimacy. We take a look at the Rashi, 4 lines from the top. Komash Malon, the Chiyasa Kra, the Pasuk comes to tell us the Gufei Asa for its own sake. The Hecha di Eino Karov Law. The Pasuk is telling me that when he's not the boel, the paramour, if he's not a relative, that paramour becomes usher through this warning that she received not to be with him. However, v'lavlim uti kroivim also. It's not coming here to exclude the possibility of a kina, of a warning with regard to other forbidden relatives. We continue. Chutz min hakoton umimi she'eno ish. Our Mishnah taught that the husband's warning to his wife has relevance, could make her usher if she's in seclusion with him, with that paramour, with the exception of a minor and mi she'eno ish. That's an expression that the Gemara will have to explain shortly. the Gemara explains, Ish Amar Achmana v'lo katan. The Torah says, V'shachav ish osab. If a man, an adult, has intimacy with her, so she becomes prohibited to her husband and to the paramour. The word ish means, in this case, an adult, to the exclusion of a minor. So a minor is not what is not included in the Torah's portion dealing with the Sotah. V'she'eno ish limutei mai. And now, before we go into this particular Omid of Gemara, we have a word or two regarding the structure. On the side of the Gemara, we have a nosei, mivneh heading. We combine the topic with the structural note together. Triangles are featured. They represent shlavim. And you'll see the use also of a double underline, highlighting the words ilemo and ella. These are shlavim, these stages. Levarer, to clarify, hadikotoni ein mekanim al yedei mi she'eno ish. What do we mean by that? That there's no kinui, there's no warning, meaning there's no relevance of a warning to a woman not to be with an Eino Ish. As we said, the markings convey the idea of stages of analysis. If your eye is sharp and you're let's say a seasoned Gemara markings Shas Ozer participant, you will notice that on this Omer there are a number of bracketed sections. How does your eye catch that? Notice a vertical dash dotted line running to the side of the Gemara text. Sometimes it's on the right hand side, sometimes on the left hand side, but nevertheless, let your eye catch those vertical dashed lines. On this Omid, I hope you see there are 3 of those. Those are bracketed sections. We're going to take a bird's eye view of this Omid before learning the text. And then we'll present the bird's eye reading of the Gemara before getting into the entire Gemara. So, first of all, you notice triangles numbered down the right-hand side, 1, 2, and 3. It means we have 3 stages in order to figure out what is meant by mi she'eno ish. Notice the double underline expressions. So the first approach is ilema limute shachuf. If mi she'eno ish is coming to exclude a shachuf, we'll have to explain what a shachuf is. It's a person who's quite ill. It's a person whose skin is deteriorating, is slipping off of his body. He's quite ill, and the manifestation of his illness is through his flesh is. It seems from Rashi, it's decomposing while he's still alive. So maybe that's what an Eino Ish is. The Gemara says that is not correct. It rejects that. Do you see where the triangle number 1 is? It says, the Gemara there says, if the Mishnah is excluding a shachuf, meaning that there's no kinui with regard to a shachuf, from a Shmuel shachuf mekanen al yodo uposel betruma. There are 2 points that Shmuel makes, and we dashed underline mekanen al yodo, that kinui does have relevance to a shachuf. So that's not what's being excluded by the Mishnah. You skip the bracketed section, you hit a triangle number 2, and the double underline vielo lemute oived kechavim. Maybe what the Mishnah is saying is that kinui, a husband, if he issues a warning, but the subject of his warning is an idol worshipper, is a Gentile, so it has no halachic import. Namely, if she is found to be in seclusion with a Gentile, she will not be prohibited to her husband. But that's not true. As you see there at stage 2, Same 2 points that we saw before by the shachuf, we see here. And it says by Oivei Kechavim Mekanan Al Yado that kinui does have relevance with regard to an idol worshipper. So that can't be the pshat in the Mishnah. Notice we have a long bracketed section again. You drop down and you hit triangle number 3. On that line it says, well, ve'elo lemutei mai. So then at this point in the Gemara, so what is misheino ish coming to exclude from the parsha of Sotah? Amarav Papa lemutei behema. The ain's nus bevehema. So he answers, if a man warns his wife, I don't want you to be in private with Rover the dog, and she goes into a locked room with Rover the dog, she will not become usher to her husband. Now, it's forbidden, of course, for a human being to have intimacy with an animal. It's punishable by stoning, by court execution, very, very severe offense. However, it doesn't fall into the parsha of Sotah. So even though it's a prohibited type of sexual intimacy, nevertheless, it doesn't fall under the heading of a Sotah. Why? The Mishnah says because there's no znus by a behema. We'll have to explain that at greater length little bit later. But at that point, we have reached our conclusion as to what Eino Ish is. It might, in fact, be the simplest answer, because when you translate the expression, it says there's no kinui regarding someone that's not a man. Well, what is not a man? An animal. So there's no kinui with regard to animals. That's the conclusion of the Gemara. So can you see, I hope everyone sees, I know that we're spending a lot of time with regard to structure, but it will make things much easier when we get into the Gemara text itself. That you see the 3 stages, and as far as what is contained in the brackets, so you'll see each time the brackets analyzes the statements that were made immediately before them, but they get involved with details. As far as the procedure in discovering what does Eino Ish mean, you see that by having taken the approach we've done, the bird's eye view using the markings. And now we turn to the Gemara to learn the Gemara straight through without all of the skippings. V'she'eino ish limutei mai, and we're at the line where you see triangle number 1. What does the Mishnah mean that there's no kinui with regard to an Eino Ish? Ilema limutei shachuf. If the intention is that if the husband would warn not to be with a man that is physically in the shachuf state, his body is decomposing while he's still alive. His skin is turning hard, is deteriorating. Someone like that would not be the subject of a kinui. Well, that's not true. V'amar Shmuel shachuf mekanen al yado posel b'truma. Kinui would be effective, and if, let us say, a woman had intimacy with a shachuf, and the shachuf happened to be a person that is forbidden to the realm of kahuna, a type of man, for example, and Rashi lists them off, a Gentile, a slave, a cholol, a nosin, a mamzer. These are people that a woman, if she would have relations with them, that woman would not be allowed to marry a Kohen. It's something to bear in mind. Amongst the list, we saw here a Gentile. So if you have a situation of a girl, a woman that at some point had a fling with a non-Jew, that woman cannot marry a Kohen. That woman is puzzle, cannot eat from truma. Ordinarily, a woman who would marry a Kohen is entitled to eat truma. She's not going to be allowed to eat truma. Not only that, but if she's a daughter of a Kohen, as a result of having intimacy with one of those people that we just mentioned, she is disqualified from continuing to consume truma. So, as far as what the Mishnah means when it says that kinui has no relevance to an Eino Ish, the Mishnah is not trying to exclude a shachuf. Now we go into the bracketed section. Mekanin al yodoi, that the husband can warn not to be with that kind of man. Pshita, is that not obvious? So mahu detema, without Shmuel teaching me this point, that mekanin al yodo, regarding a shachuf, I would have thought, based on the pasuk, v'shochav ish oiso shichva zera omar rachmona. The pasuk in the Parsha of Sotah describes a man having intimacy with the woman in a fashion where there's shichva zera, where there is male seed, and they will say the potential for reproduction. V'hai lav bar hochihu, and a shachuf is incapable of that. Komash Malon, Shmuel tells us that even so, mekanin al yodo. The second point that Shmuel made was upoisel betruma, intimacy with the shachuf. If he's one of the forbidden men that we mentioned before, it would disqualify her from truma. Pshita. Well, is that not obvious? If the shachuf happens to be a Gentile, is he not a Gentile? If he's a slave, is he not a slave? So those people disqualify women from further truma consumption. Why does Shmuel have to tell me that? Mahu detemo. See, I would have thought lo yechalel zaroi oma rachmona. The Torah, when it speaks about prohibited relations with regard to the kahuna, it says lo yechalel zaro. The is le zera lichlal. The less le zera lo lichlal. I would have taken that to mean that a man that has seed, has male seed, he can ruin a woman through intimacy. A man that doesn't have seed, like the shachuf, wouldn't be capable of disqualifying the woman from truma. Komash malon. Now, here, if we look in the Rashi to appreciate this, Komash malon Shmuel de posel. Shmuel informs us that he does pasel. Shaminon le meha diomar mekanin al yedei shachuf. We derive this from that which he said, that a warning concerning a paramour that happens to be a shachuf has relevance. So we see that as far as his ability to create prohibition on the part of the woman to her husband, it shows us that he also would be able to impart truma prohibition if he, this shachuf, happens to be one of those forbidden men. We turn back to the Gemara, V'ela. We realize we are going back to the question of what does mi she'eino ish mean in the Mishnah. Well, V'ela lemute oivei kechovim. Maybe what the Mishnah is saying is that a warning that a husband issues to his wife not to be with a paramour who happens to be a Gentile, that would not be a warning. That wouldn't be an example of a Sotah. But Rav Hamnuna teaches oivei kechovim mekanen al yado posel betruma. Just like we said before, by the shachuf, the oivei kechovim can be the subject of a kinui, mekanen, the kinui, the warning, and intimacy with the oivei kechovim will render her prohibited from eating truma. And now in the bracket, mekanen al yado pshita, isn't that obvious that kinui would include a warning against being with an idol worshipper, with a Gentile? So mahu detema. I might have thought, without Rav Hamnuna telling me this, I would have thought nitma shtei pomim echad lebal ve'echad leboyel. We saw this type of reasoning up on the top line as well. That the fact that the Torah repeats the word nitma, one is telling us that she becomes prohibited to her husband, and the other nitma tells us that she becomes prohibited forever to the boil, to the paramour. Well, I would have thought that the Sotah Parsha is applicable, the Sotah section of the Torah is applicable to women that become prohibited in this act of intimacy. In other words, without this act of intimacy, she wouldn't have been prohibited to that man. But when it comes to a Gentile, since she's prohibited anyway, it's quite well known that Judaism prohibits what we call intermarriage. It prohibits intimacy with people that are not Jews. So she was usher to him anyway. So I would have thought that the Parsha of Sotah doesn't apply. Therefore, Rav Hamnuna had to tell me not to think thusly. Namely, that even though he is prohibited anyway, the kinui still has relevance if the kinui happened to be against seclusion with a Gentile. The second point that was made above was uposel b'truma. The oivit yichavim, intimacy with a Gentile, will disqualify the daughter of a Kohen from continuing the eating of truma. Pshita, is that not obvious? The Gemara answers. Now notice, this is a long answer. So Mahu Detema, without Rav Hamnuna, I would have thought, Ubas Kohen Kisiye Leish Zor Omar Rachmona. The section of the Torah that describes disqualification from Truma speaks about the daughter of a Kohen, Kisiya. The word Tihiyeh is of central importance for us right now. And that's what the Torah says. A woman that is Tiyelizar, Debar Havayoin. The word Tihiyeh indicates marriage. Legal halachic marriage. Debar Havayoin, someone who is capable, who is, let's say, recognized by halacha of having legal marriage potential. Someone like that could disqualify through his intimacy. However, Dalav Bar Havayalo, someone who doesn't have a halachically recognized marriage possibility, an idol worshiper, a Gentile. There's no concept in halacha of, we'll call the concept of marriage between a Jew and a Gentile. It's just, there's no halachic bond that takes place. Physically, they might have a fling one with the other, but has no halachic status. So I would have thought that someone like that's not a bar havaya. Bar means capable of havaya, capable of marriage. When we say capable of marriage, you mean in a legalistic halachic sense. So he's not what the Torah had in mind when it spoke about a man disqualifying a woman through intimacy from eating truma. Kamash malon de posil. Mida Rav Yochanan. Rav Hamnuna tells us that he does render her, he meaning the Gentile, even though he's not a bar havaya, he does render her unfit to continue eating truma. Based on Rabbi Yochanan, Mida Rabbi Yochanan, Dama Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan in turn quoting the Tana Rabbi Shmuel, Minayin loivid kichovim ve'evet shebo al hakohenes v'al halaviyah v'al bas Yisrael sheposlu. From where do we know that an idol worshiper or a slave that has intimacy with a rank and file Jewish woman, whether she's the daughter of a Kohen, a Levi, or a Yisrael, that renders her unfit to Truma? Shenemar, not only unfit to Truma, but I should point out, it renders her unfit to marry a Kohen. Shenemar, the Pasuk says with regard to a woman, that let us say she's the daughter of a Kohen that was married to a Yisrael. The daughter of a Kohen that's married to Yisrael is not allowed to continue eating truma, but if she becomes a widow, she goes back to her father's home. The daughter of a Kohen, for example, gets divorced. She was married to a Yisrael. She wasn't able to eat truma when she's married to Yisrael, but she got divorced from Yisrael. She goes back to her father's house and resumes eating truma. So the pasuk says regarding that phenomenon of her going back home to Kohen father's house, It says in the pasuk, "Ubas kohen kisiye almona ugrusha." And the continuation of the pasuk, you can see we've quoted the pasuk in its entirety on the side. Vayikra perik chof beis pasuk yud gimel. Let's read what we have on the side of the Gemara. Ubas kohen kisiye almona ugrusha. Vizera ein lo, and she has no children from her non-Kohen husband. V'shavel beisovia kinurel milechem avios tochel v'chozar lo yochal bo. She goes back to her father's house, who happens to be a Kohen, and she resumes eating truma. Now we go back to our Gemara text. Since the pasuk says ubas kohen kisiel almonu grusha, mi sheyesh lo almonus v'gerushin ba. What kind of woman resumes the eating of truma? A woman that happened to be with a man that the concept of widowhood or the concept of divorce has relevance. I say concept of divorce, what's more than a concept? It's the legal phenomenon of divorce taking place has relevance. That's true when you're dealing with a Bas Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, that happened to have been with married to a regular Jew. However, Yotzu Oived Kechavim Ve'eved She'ein Lo Almonus V'Gerishin Ba. This pasuk will exclude a woman, or I should say, this pasuk will disqualify a woman from eating truma if she happened to have been with a man that doesn't have almonus and gerishin in her, a Gentile or a slave. If a woman is a Jewish woman, we'll say intermarried, in terms of halacha, there's no divorce that's necessary. She was never married to him. I'm not talking right now about secular governmental requirements. That's not of any concern to this particular discussion. A Jewish woman that happens to be with a Gentile, there's no divorce. There's no halachic Jewish divorce that's necessary. She just walks out. If he dies, she's not described as an almona, as a widow. And the same is true with regard to a slave. So it's from that we understand that an Ovid Kechavim or an Eved will disqualify a woman from resuming the consumption of Truma. Well, but don't forget, what's our topic? What's the Eino Ish that the Mishnah referred to? The Elo Lemute Mai, who is excluded from Kinui by the Mishnah telling us that there's no Kinui from an Eino Ish? Omar Rav Papa Lemute Behema. The Ein Znus Bevehema. The Mishnah is telling us that a kinui stated to a woman, a warning to one's wife, don't be in private, don't go into seclusion with Rover, the German Shepherd. That has no kinui relevance. Namely, if she goes into seclusion with the dog, she's not going to become prohibited to her husband. And why is that? Because what is it that does make her prohibited to the husband? Her going into seclusion with that which the concept of znus has relevance. It's the word znus it's hard to approach the word znus by simple literal translation. Znus, if you were to translate it as forbidden intimacy, that would not be accurate over here, because intimacy with a behema is forbidden. But znus represents a halachic concept, and the Gemara will explain how do you evaluate that? How do you prove when something is classified as znus as opposed to something, though it's a prohibited intimacy, you're dealing with a prohibited sexual intercourse, but it's not called znus. It doesn't have the halachic status of znus. What creates sotah? A seclusion with a human being where the concept of znus does have relevance. Now, how do we evaluate that? How do you demonstrate what is considered znus? That is what we do in the bracketed section right now. These brackets are a bit different than the brackets that we had before, in the sense that the use of the brackets before was simply to enable you to see quickly what was the Mishnah teaching when it said there's no kinui by Eino Ish. We've come to that conclusion right now. Eino Ish is a behema. On the side we have a note. You'll note there's a double star. Achrei HaSugrayim, after these brackets, HaGemara mityacheses l'prat shemuskar l'mala. The Gemara will go back to a detail that was mentioned above. Within the brackets, the Gemara will be proving that the concept of znus has no relevance to to sexual intimacy with a behema, with an animal. If you want to skip momentarily, even though these brackets are not really for skipping purposes, you'll notice the Gemara there after the brackets says V'ela shichva zera lomali. Using your arrow, you can see way up on the page, the corresponding arrow, at which point the Gemara mentioned in the shachuf discussion. I might have thought that shachuf in fact is excluded because the pasuk says v'shachav isha shichva zera. The Gemara then told us no, the shachuf is not excluded. Well, if the shachuf is not excluded, so then what does that pasuk shichva zera in fact teach me? Okay, we'll get back to that in Mitzvah Hashem a little later. Let's go through now the brackets. Omar le Rava mi Parzakya le Ravashi. Minoha milsa diomar rabbanan ein znus bevehema. Rava asks Ravashi, from where do the rabbanan derive this concept of ein znus bevehema? Dichtiv lo sovi esnan zoina umechir kelev beis Hashem Elokecha. The pasuk is teaching that when one considers what to bring as a sacrifice, one shall not bring as a sacrifice to the Beis Hamikdash something that's called an esnan zona or a mechir kelev. What are these things? Very simply, a person has a sheep, and the sheep is a type of animal that, if everything is okay, it's fit to be offered as a sacrifice. You can sanctify it and bring it as a sacrifice. Let's say you took the sheep and you paid a harlot for services rendered. You gave a woman a sheep in exchange for her providing you with sexual intimacy. That animal is prohibited as a sacrifice. Esnan zona, we'll say it's a payment made to a lady for harlotry relations. Another thing is mentioned in the pasuk, mechir kelev. What is that? Imagine a person exchanged. Let's say he bartered a sheep in exchange for a dog. So I gave you a sheep, and you gave me your dog. Now that you have the sheep, that sheep cannot be brought as a sacrifice. Vitanya. We continue reading in the Gemara. Esnan kelev umechir zona. Notice the switch around. An esnan kelev and mechir zona mutorin. What is an esnan kelev? So you take a look at Rashi. Rashi that we're looking at is in the lower part of the narrow lines. Esnan kelev shim adam oimer lezona. Imagine a man approaches a harlot. Halach tleh, I want to give you a sheep. V'hibuali l'kalbi, and I want you, Mrs. Harlot, to have sexual intercourse with my dog. So what did he do? He paid the harlot for services, not that she would provide the man with her harlotrous services, but she would be with the dog, an act of bestiality. Now this is disgusting. It is reprehensible and prohibited, and you can use any other adjective you like. But one thing is that the sheep that she received for her bestial relations with the dog, that sheep is kosher to be brought as a sacrifice. That's an esnan kelev. So what happened over here? She had relations with a dog. Oh. That, you can see, is therefore not called znus. What did the Torah prohibit? A gift, a sheep, given to a zonah. A zonah is not just a harlot, but it happens to be it's a harlot, and the relations would be classified as nus. The payment of the sheep for her to have relations with the animal is not called znus. What else is mutter? Mechir zona. What is that? Rashi. Mechir zona. Rashi says, Hoiso lo shivcha zona. A person happened to have a bondmate that happened to also be a harlot. V'chlifa bekleh. And he took his bondmate and he went to his friend and said, I need a sheep. I will give you this human slave, bondmaid, Zona, take her and give me your sheep. That sheep is allowed to be brought as a sacrifice. It's not a sheep given in exchange for a dog. It's a sheep that was given in exchange for a Zona. Rashi goes on, Umidika esnan kelev mutter, from the fact that we're teaching here that the gift, the payment given to the harlot for her having relations with the dog is allowed, michlal de lavs nusu. These nusu have a chayil oleo shem esnan. Had that act been called an act of znus, so then the payment given to the harlot for her relations with the dog would have been considered an esnan. As we saw, the pasuk said, Lo savi esnan zona. So that from here we derive that the act of relations with the dog doesn't fall under the halachic category or into the halachic concept of znus. Now, how do we know that? When we read the pasuk, Lo savi esnan zona mechir kelev, how do you know that only those are prohibited, but when you switch them around, namely, instead of saying esnan zona, it's an esnan kelev or mechir zona, the sheep in those cases would be allowed. Shenemar, the pasuk says, Gam shnehem, shnayim v'lo arba. Two are prohibited, namely esnan zona and mechir kelev. Those are the two examples of prohibition, but two more examples are not. It's the two and not four. And as we said, here the Gemara refers back to a point mentioned earlier. There's a pasuk, Bamidbar, Perek Hey, pasuk Yud Gimel. We had cited this earlier. Let's look at the side of the Gemara. It says, V'shachav ish oisa shichva zera, v'ne'ela me'einei isha, v'nistera v'hi nitma, v'eid ein ba, v'hi lo nitpasa. The Gemara asks, in light of what we said earlier, that V'shachav ish oisa shichva zera does in fact not come to exclude the shachuf. Without Shmuel, I would have thought that pasuk would exclude the shachuf, but it doesn't do that. So what does it do? V'lashichva zera lomali. What does this pasuk in Bamidbar Hey, pasuk Yud Gimel, teach us? And I can't emphasize enough, this pasuk, I'm sure you know, I know I'm saying the obvious, this pasuk is in the parsha of Sotah. When you see Bamidbar Hey, most of Bamidbar Hey talks about Sotah. So what relevance does this pasuk have with regard to the realm of Sotah? Mi boyale l'chedetanya. I need it for the following teaching. Shichva zera prat l'dover acher. The term shichva zera is coming to exclude something else that would not be considered a kinui. My dover acher, what's that other thing that's not considered a kinui? That wouldn't fall under the category of a halachic warning a husband issues to his wife. On the side of the Gemara, you see we have a nosei/mivne heading. A diamond appears. Maybe your eye caught a number of diamonds in the Gemara text. Shichva zera prat l'dover acher. Dugma shel kinui she'eno kinui. Shlavim levar mahu dover acher. The diamond represents stages in order to figure out what does this Tanaic source mean when it says prat l'dover acher. Omar Rav Sheshes prat l'shekina law shelo kedarka. We mentioned that the Gemara appears in stages, so we'll give explanations, but you have to realize at each point we're going to reject the explanation until we get to the end. So the thinking right now is a husband warns his wife, I don't want you to have intimacy in a shelo kedarka fashion with so-and-so. Shelo kedarka is we'll call it, it's a male act of intimacy with the woman in a way that's not through the normal female orifice of reproduction, but it's his intimacy with her through shelo kedarka, in the other orifice that appears in the female anatomy. So if a husband would warn his wife, I don't want you to go into private with so and so for an act of intimacy in a shelo kedarka fashion, well, that would not be considered a warning. It wouldn't have the Sotah connotation. Amalei Rava says that's not true. Shelo kedarka mishkevei ishuksiv. When the Torah warns against forbidden intimacy, a woman married to a particular man, she's not allowed to be in intimacy with any other man, and the Torah says mishkevei isha. Mishkevei is a word in the plural. That means whether it's through the normal orifice of reproduction or the other orifice as well. That's when I say the other orifice, it's in the other orifice, in that part of the female anatomy, that area of her body. Well, so then, if that, namely shelo kedarka, is not the intention of this source, prat l'dover acher, then what is? Elo amarova, prat l'shekina lo derech evorim. That would be, if you look in the Rashi, you will see, without reading it together right now, you see it's called shchiva b'kiruv basar. Means he warns his wife, I don't want you to have, we'll say, bodily contact. And when we say bodily contact, we're not implying actual intercourse, but simply lying together, we'll say unclothed, in the same bed. So that would not be considered a kinui. Omar lei Abaye. Abaye says, Pritzusa bi'almo hi, u pritzusa mi osa rachmona. Pritzusa is an expression that refers to, we'll say, extreme immodesty. For a married woman to have, let's say, bodily contact with another man, it's reprehensible, it's pritzus, it's disgusting, it's improper. However, would that make a woman prohibited to her husband? When the Gemara says pritzusa mi osar rachmona, mi osar means, would the Torah, rachmona is the Torah, would it prohibit a wife to be with her husband, to go back to her husband if she happened to have been engaged in pritzus, simply lying unclothed with another man in the same bed? No. It's, as I said, we're not sanctioning that. That's a terrible thing to do. However, that kind of reprehensible behavior is not sufficiently problematic to render the woman prohibited to her husband. Elo Omar Abaye. So what does Dover Acher refer to? Prat l'shekina law b'neshika. Now, here's a case in point that translation would be a very a very big disservice. The word neshika is a euphemism. So what does it refer to? Neshika is the male organ having, we'll say, a contact with the female in an incomplete fashion. What do we mean by that? So there are two approaches, and we'll go through, as we go through the Gemara, you will see the two approaches. So does a warning that a husband issues to his wife, I don't want you to be in seclusion with so-and-so in a neshika fashion, that would not be considered kinui. Well, ha-nicha lemanda omar he'ara zu hachnosas haTorah avol neshika v'lo klumhi hainu da'asi kra. The pasuk of Shichva Sarah is coming to lim'ute neshika. The Torah speaks about an act called he'ara. Rashi quotes the psukim es mikora he'era, es she'ero he'era. That word he'ara, or he'era as the Gemara presents it, is a reference to a partial act of intercourse. How much is it? So, he'ara, according to this first approach, is considered hachnosas haTorah. Hachnosas haTorah is, as we say, a partial insertion. We'll say the tip or the extreme end of the male organ is in fact inserted. There's a partial insertion. That is considered an act that the Torah prohibits as an act of intimacy. So if that he'ara is defined as hachnosas haTorah, a less invasive or a lesser level of insertion, merely a superficial contact, neshikas, just simply where there's simple contact without any insertion whatsoever, that would be nothing. If that's nothing, and when I say nothing, again, it's disgusting, it's certainly immoral, and etc. and so forth, but nothing in terms of prohibiting a married woman, to returning to her husband if she happened to do this with another man. So Hainu, as we read already, if you say that he'ara, that the Torah prohibits as formal act of intimacy, so then neshika is left as simply nothing. And Hainu da'asi kra lemute neshika, the pasuk of Shichva Sarah is coming to tell me that neshika is a nothing. Elolaman domar, continuing in the Gemara, diomar he'era zu neshika. There's another approach that says that when the Torah prohibits he'era, we cited the psukim before. You can see them in the Rashi, second line from the bottom, es mekora he'era or es she'era. What is the Torah saying that is forbidden to do? According to this other opinion, that is neshika. Neshika, that's the male organ having a contact without insertion, contact with the female at her area of, let's say, gender identity, without insertion. My ika lememar. What then can you say as to the role of the pasuk Shichva Sarah? What's it coming to exclude? Because according to this opinion, that hera is neshika, that means that neshika is a formal act of prohibited intimacy. You couldn't say then that the kinui would exclude that. L'olam, stage 4, which is really a throwback to what was said by Rava at stage 2. L'olam l'shekina lo derech evaram. The case is that the husband had warned her, I don't want you to go into seclusion for the purpose of lying together with another man without the act of intimacy. Simply lying bekiruv basar, as Rashi says. we said before, that's obvious. You wouldn't have thought, you wouldn't need a pasuk to tell me that she is not prohibited to her husband if that's all that would have happened. Without the pasuk and the Tanaic source that said prat l'davar acher, without that, I would have thought bikpeda de baal talya rachmana ubaal hakakopid, that the rules of kinui are established on a subjective basis. Namely, her husband is makpid, objects. That kinui is defined, as we say, subjectively by this particular man's level of objection. And he expresses his objection to the derech evarim. Komash Malon, the pasuk of Shikva Zera, reveals to us that she does not become prohibited with a kinui that focused, that specified derech evarim. We continue in the Gemara with a new topic. On the side, you'll notice we have a nosei, a topic heading, Lisa Duma o Bas Duma, Machlokes Shmuel for Rabbi Yochanan. A man is confronted with a choice of marrying one of two women. That's all. These are the only women that are available for this man. That's, of course, we're setting up we'll call it a theoretical scenario in order to appreciate the machlokes, the controversy between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Two women that are available to a man, and he has to make a choice. Should he marry a Duma or marry a Bas Duma? And of course, everyone is asking, what in the world is a Duma and what's a Bas Duma? A Duma is a woman who is suspect of engaging in harlotry. Duma literally has to do with speech, with murmurings. The kind of woman that attracts attention and people talk about her. What kind of woman is that? A woman that engages in harlotry. Everyone is, people start to talk about her waywardness, her lifestyle. A Bas Duma is, as you probably guessed, it's the daughter of such a woman. What are the considerations? Let's go on in the Gemara and we'll see each point of view. Omar Shmuel, Yisa Adam. We continue at the top of the Chof Zayin. Duma, Va'al Yisa Bas Duma. It would be better, if that's the only choice that he has to choose one of them, it would be better for him to choose the Duma than the Bas Duma. Shezu, the mother, that may mean the Duma, Ba mi Tipa Kshera. Her parents were fine people. Tipa literally is the drop of human seed. In other words, she comes from parents that were kosher people. And therefore, the Duma, even though she's chosen an objectionable lifestyle, nevertheless, she herself comes from, we'll say, a kosher pedigree. Vizu, the daughter, Ba mi Tipa Psula. We look in Rashi on the first narrow line. Vizu Ba mi Tipa mi Bia Psula. He has a different girsa than our Gemara, but it's the same idea. Bia Psula means forbidden intimacy. Shema me'oivek kechavim o mamzer. You have a lady who practices a very free lifestyle. She has relations with any man that comes by, including idol worshippers or mamzerim. What would that make of the girl then? Certainly, if the fellow was a mamzer, she would be a mamzeres, and an acceptable Jew, rank and file Jew from the Jewish community, wouldn't want to marry a mamzeres. Would be prohibited. She would be prohibited to him. So that the daughter of the Duma, the harlotress type, she is more problematic. For Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Yisodom Bas Duma Val Yisoduma. Rabbi Yochanan says it's better for a man to choose actually the daughter of the Duma than the Duma herself. Shezu Oimedes Becheskas Kashrus. The daughter, she's a fine girl in terms of her morality. Where she comes from is a different story, but in terms of her own daily conduct, she's fine. And therefore, if a man marries her, he doesn't have to suspect that she's going to go with other men and thereby become prohibited to him, to the husband. However, Vizu, the Duma, Eino Medes Bechezkas Kashrus. You married a woman like that, you can very, very reasonably assume she's going to, after you marry her, she's going to go back to her harlocious ways and be with other men. And if she goes with other men as a married woman, she's prohibited to you, the husband. If we take a look in the Rashi, Vizu Eino Oimedes Bechezkas Kashrus Shemezane Tachtov, she will continue her znus while married to him, V'neser Salov, and become prohibited to you, to the husband. Vehu Eino Roeh, he doesn't see, V'eino Megarsha, Ubal Ebiser, he's not aware, he doesn't know for sure, and he's not going to divorce her, and the husband that continues living with a wife like that is living in sin daily. So we now have presented the two opinions, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Meisvei, we raise an objection, and from this source it says, Noisei Odom Duma. This would be a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, Al Yisa Duma. Here it says, a man should marry a Duma. Amar Rava v'tizbara. Rava says, this source needs to be explained. He says, is it reliable? No say. L'chatchila, the source says, no say, you should marry a Duma. Is that really so? Is that the recommended type wife one should seek? Elo im nasa. The source cannot be left as it is, reading no say, but rather it should be at least understood, if not actually textually reread, as im nasa, if a person married. In other words, it's not stating a first choice. The source is telling us that if a man married a Duma, so his children will still be considered kosher. Well then, Tninami Bas Duma, so then once you're restating the source, you can restate it as reading Bas Duma. We take a look at the Rashi across from here, V'tizbra, no say lechatchila vadai mekalkulale, to suggest the man should choose a Duma as a wife. She's going to mess up on him. She'll very likely be with other men. Ela al korchoch mishabeshtahi, the source is as it is itself messed up, is shibush, a mistake. Uboyas letrutz, you have to straighten it out, ulemisni, and rather read it as follows. Im nosa adam Duma muter, if a person married a Duma, so it's okay. The kevon de boys letrutza, and since you have to restate the source, you have to straighten it out. Alma tano lav dafka. The tano is not dafka. I mean, it's not meduik. It's not precise. V'lo mosvinon minon. You can't use it as a basis for asking questions on other opinions. The ikolamema bahonami tall. There's room to say that in this area you also made a mistake. Tninami bastuma. And state it as Bastuma, like Rabbi Yochanan. Ve'anan nami ki amrinon yisa odom zu velo yisa zu. In our original discussion, we saw the Gemara saying yisa, person, sounds like the same problem. That you should marry a Duma, not marry a Bastuma, or vice versa. Lav lechatchila im yimtza acheres. It's not a first choice if you have some kind of other option. Ella demi sheina motze ela shtayim elu. As we said in our introduction to this section, regarding someone that has no other choice than these two, then we say choose this over that. The Gemara continues, Vehilchasa yisa odom bas duma v'al yisa duma. The Gemara rules like Rabbi Yochanan that if given that that's those two are your only choices, choose the bas duma and not the duma. The Toni Rav Tachlifa bar Marovo Kamed Rabbi Yavo. By the way, before we go on, what was the possible problem with the bas duma? Well, we don't know where she comes from. After all, her mother is a duma. So we're telling you now that doesn't present a big problem. Why? Based on Rav Tachlifa's teaching. He taught in front of Rabbi Yavo the following: Isha mezana, bonel ksherim, a woman who is a suspect of being a zoina, meaning she's suspect of harlotry. Her children are kosher. Rov be'ilos achar habal. The majority of her intimacies are with her husband. It's true, if she's a married woman and has intimacy with another man, the resultant child is a mamzer, is not kosher. But when you don't know anything, you have a woman that has a loose lifestyle, nevertheless you can rely on the fact, or you can rely on the phenomenon of what he teaches here, that the majority of her acts of intimacy are with her husband. And when you have doubt, you can base yourself on the rove, on a majority. Here the Gemara raises a question. It takes a number of lines to develop the question. Boy Rav Amram, hoisa prutza beyoser mahu. Imagine you have a woman that is exceptionally frivolous, prutza, exceptionally loose. What is the story with her children? Aliba demand omar, according to this, the first of two opinions that the Gemara will present, there really is no, we're not going to be asking the question. But it's rather according to the second mandomar. You can see we've underlined the expression mandomar where the question will come to a head. So, in Aliba demand omar, ein isha misaberes ela somuch levesta, lo tibayaloch de lo yodaba v'lo mintar lo. According to the opinion that the most opportune time for a woman to become pregnant is somuch levesta, means right before. The word somuch, it's a tricky word. Sometimes it means next to, whether it's before or after. You have to evaluate it in context. There is an opinion that says that the time for, the most opportune time for a woman to become pregnant is right before the appearance of her female menstrual cycle, the vesta, the appearance of blood. So right before that, then let's assume that we're dealing, as Tosfos says, with a woman whose cycle is not consistent. It's not with regularity. It lacks regularity. It's in halachic terms we say lo kova veses. So a husband, according to this opinion, he is not going to know when his wife is most likely to become pregnant. So since he doesn't know, he's not able to watch over her. That's lo mintar. Mintar is to watch, supervise. He's not going to be in a position to supervise because it can happen any time. So in a case like that, the husband's ability to supervise is pretty much null. And from the context of the Gemara, with Rashi's explanation that we're asking about the children would then be quite, we'll say, highly questionable. Ki tiboy aloch aliba demand omar ein isha misaberes elo somuch l'tvilasa mai. Rav Amram's question is with regard to a woman, according to the opinion, we'll say is regarding a woman who's very, very loose. According to the opinion that a woman's most likely time to become pregnant is right after her immersion in the mikveh. Let us make the assumption that even though we're dealing with a woman who's prutza, but husbands are aware, and these women will go to the mikveh, the ritual bath that purifies her and makes her, enables her to be permitted to her husband. That's the time that women become, that is most likely that they will become pregnant. So now the question is analyzed. Kevan de yodaba neturi mintarla. Since he, the husband, knows when she goes to mikveh, so he'll have his eye on her. He'll supervise her. That's the time that's most likely for her to become pregnant. And as far as the question of children's identity, children's kashrus, he'll be able to supervise that. Or possibly, since she happens to be a very loose woman, there is still room to consider that she will slip out on him. And he won't have supervision over her. Teku. So this remains unresolved. I should point out, even though maybe it was quite obvious from the context, Rashi Hoysa Prutsa Biyosir, Rashi that I'm looking at right now, is a little more than halfway down. The woman that Rav Amram was asking about, the exceptionally loose woman, the Iko Lemechash, in a case of Prutsa Biyosir, very loose, there is room to suspect the Roiv Bilosel Mishalachem, that the majority of her acts of intimacy are in fact with others. What about the kashrus of her children? So as we said, this question was focused, or this question can be asked only according to the opinion that says that Isha Misabera Somach L'Tvilasa, because according to the opinion Isha Misabera Somach L'Vesta, there's no way the husband would be able to supervise her. So the children's kashrus would be highly questionable, because Rov Biloseh are really with others. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.